Thanks, Chris. Back again. I should have said hello earlier. I'm Matt. I'm one of the leaders here. It's my privilege to speak to us this morning to help us look together at what God has to say to us. Now, I got a lot to say about today's passage, so we're going to get to the passage quickly. But before we do, I want to know, have you ever met someone who just seems to think that they are special? That they're really someone. And obviously you are not, in contrast to them. Always somebody who feels like they're this rank above you. You know, who likes horrible histories? Horrible histories. Who knows the song "Born to Rule Over You"? You ever met those people who are like, "I was born to rule over you. It's my job." They feel like everyone ought to stand when they come into the room. Now, imagine there was somebody like that who chooses all of a sudden to put their life on hold and instead come look after you for a day. They decide they're going to vacuum for you. They'd like to do your washing up. They'd actually like to make you a cup of tea, carry your bags, do your homework. Now, that would be nice, wouldn't it? That would make you sit up and think, wouldn't it? That would be quite something. Well, as we carry on our journey through the life of Jesus, as Matthew's gospel tells it, today's story is definitely going to make us think. So come with me to Matthew chapter 17, and we're going to pick up the story at verse 24. Matthew 17 is page 984 in our blue church Bibles, and look for the tiny 24, and Susie is going to read for us this morning.
After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours."
Thanks, Susie. Now, that is a short story, right? That doesn't take long to read. Jesus explains there's this tax. He doesn't have to pay it, but he pays it anyway through a miracle. All done. Short story, but there is plenty to think about in here. And we're going to need a little bit of background before we can really get into thinking about what's going on here. So let's start with the 2 drachma temple tax. This is a kind of artist. They didn't take any pictures at the time, but an artist recreation of what the temple might have looked like in Jerusalem. It's the center of Jewish religious worship. And a bit like church, what went on there has a cost, right? There's a building. They had a big building too, as it turns out. There's a building. It needs some upkeep. There are people who work there to pay. There's stuff getting used up all the time there, sacrificial animals here, coffee, largely. How does all that get paid for? Well, the answer was mostly through an annual tax paid by every Jewish guy over about 22 drachmas. Doesn't make much sense to us, doesn't mean anything. 2 drachmas about 2 days' wages. But notice there is some uncertainty over whether Jesus is going to pay this tax. If it was a Roman tax, if it was like a government thing, there wouldn't be an option. The authorities simply come for you if you don't pay the taxes, right? But there's a question over whether Jesus is going to pay this one. And there's a question because it is not entirely clear that this tax had a solid footing in the Torah, in the ancient rule book of the Jewish people. There's something which looks a little bit like it in a story of Moses connected to a census, counting all the people. There's a how-to guide with all the details there in Exodus 30. I'm not going to read this through, but we only actually hear God commanding Moses to take a census twice, not every year. And then there's silence until about 800 BC when 2 Chronicles 24 mentions an annual levy for the temple, which they connect back to Moses. Then another 400 years later, 400 BC, there's talk of a command for an annual levy in the book of Nehemiah, but for a different amount of money. So it's all a bit like, what is going on here? What's the deal? And in Jesus' day, some Jewish groups were questioning whether this temple tax was really one of those things you had to do. Was it really legit? So there's one group, the Pharisees, who are like, this is a great idea. It looks like they've started taking this tax recently. Another group, the Sadducees, they're like, this is a really bad idea. It doesn't actually come from the Torah. We shouldn't do it. Another group called the Essenes, who are like, we read what Moses said. We think we should do this once in a lifetime and never again. So it actually makes sense that they might be wondering, Jesus and his new group of kind of Jewish people, because they're inside the Jewish envelope at this stage, how are they going to respond to this? It makes sense they might have their own opinion. Now, Peter is confident Jesus will pay, which I think is a little bit surprising, really. You know, it's like a little bit presumptuous of Peter, really. Yeah, of course he pays the temple tax. He doesn't think he even needs to ask. But Jesus has something to teach Peter, and this is where he's got something to teach us too. First, Jesus wants to teach us about privileges. Like we started now, privilege in our culture can be a bit of a dirty word. If you have privilege, you should feel bad about it. And you should make sure you don't have privilege. You should feel guilty. Jesus has a different kind of conception of privilege in view. He has something much more wonderful in mind. And he tells this little story in the middle of today's passage to explain. From who do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? Well, from others. Peter answered, do princes and princesses pay tax? Well, I had to ask ChatGPT because I didn't know offhand. And it turns out the situation here in the UK is complicated, as you might expect, knotty and twisted. It seems there are things like sovereign grants, crown estates, and duchies. I didn't know what a duchy was until I looked it up. But a duchy is basically stuff royals own that gives them money. It's quite nice. I could have a duchy. I'll do that. But it seems like even our prince and princesses, even our king, pays taxes. Some taxes, voluntarily, as it turns out. Unfortunate for our UK royals, right? Things aren't just what they used to be. See, Jesus' story is reflecting the historical norm. Most of time, most places, what happens is, of course, the king's children do not pay taxes. They're the ones who receive the taxes. Really straightforward most of the time. They're the ones being paid. Peter knows that. It's totally obvious to him the children of the king don't pay. It's all the other people who do pay. We know that, right? We pay. The children, as Jesus puts it, are exempt. Or if you look at the original language there, the word exempt translates a word that can also mean free. The children are free. Well, so what? Is Jesus teaching us about royal finances just in case there are any royal people here today who need an update on how things should work for them? Obviously not, though if you are a royal here today, very glad to have you with us, Your Majesties. But that's not really what he's trying to do. What his point is, he's showing us his own privilege as the son of the great king. Now, if you've been with us the last few weeks, one of the things the narrative has been underlining as we've worked our way through it is this truth about Jesus' identity, right? He is the Son. He is the loved one. He's the well-pleasing. He's the one and only. 2 weeks back, we heard this from the voice in the cloud on the top of the mountain. God the Father's repeated words, stating and emphasizing this unique family relationship. So what's Jesus' point with that little story about kings and children and taxes? His point is the children are free. A tax for the temple, a tax for the house of the great King God, might be paid by others, but the Son is free. Jesus does not need to pay. He has a prince's privilege. But as I started to think about this, there is more in here as well. If we think about the temple this tax relates to, if we trace the line of the temple through the long story of the Bible, fundamentally, it leads straight to Jesus because fundamentally the temple is the place where God meets humanity. That's what the temple is, where God encounters humanity. So in the beginning of the Bible, we have God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden. The garden's like a proto-temple, as it were. And then if we follow the thread, Moses goes up the mountain and meets with God on the mountain. It's like a temple. Heaven meets earth. God meets people. And then God establishes a pattern for what's called the tabernacle, a special tent where he will come and meet with people. And that becomes, over time, a plan for a physical building, a temple, which is the place where God comes to meet with people. And then then in John's gospel, right at the beginning, as he's introducing who Jesus is, he tells us this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, that word dwelling there is literally tabernacling, which happens to be the same word as this tent, this tabernacle, which they had as the place that God met with people. It's an awkward word, but John uses it deliberately to connect Jesus to the tabernacle where God met with people. Jesus is the true and better temple. He is now where God is meeting with people. Jesus pointed this out himself earlier in Matthew's gospel. He says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. As he's speaking about it, he's saying, I am the one that is greater than the temple. So with that in mind, right, it makes even more sense that Jesus is free from this tax for the temple, because Jesus is the temple. He should be the one who receives it, not pays it. But as they say in all the best commercials, but wait, there's more. See, as I kept thinking about this passage, here's the thing. Jesus' parable was not about the king's son. It wasn't about the king's son, one prince. If you look closely, it was about the children of the king. Now, you might be thinking, it's just a random detail. Don't get carried away. It's a story Jesus was telling. It's just a few letters between child and children. It's a few letters in the original language between children and child as well. Are we in danger of reading too much into things if we build a lot on just a few letters? Well, I don't think so, because as you go on through today's reading, though there is this freedom, at the end of the reading, Jesus set out a supernatural and frankly quite bizarre way in which the tax will be paid. He says it's going to be paid through the mouth of a fish. And he does that. Notice in that payment of the tax all these little details. In verse 27, it is we who are not to cause offense, not just Jesus. It's a 4 drachma coin for a 2 drachma tax. Now, I don't know how good your mental arithmetic is, but 2 is not 4. How many 2's in 4? 2. Jesus is explicit in the end. Give it to them for my tax and yours. So Jesus is including Peter in his provision for the tax he doesn't have to pay, implying that neither does Peter need to pay. Start to think about this. It becomes something quite big, something quite significant. See, the freedom that Jesus has, the privilege he has as the prince, the son of the great king, Jesus is telling us here that we share that same privilege. It's extended by Jesus. It becomes the privilege of all God's children. And actually, when we were talking about the temple, the place where people meet with God, it actually makes sense even to draw that line further. Where now does God meet with people? Where now does our world encounter him? Well, in his church. What do we mean by that? A building at a particular time? No, we mean the people. Through us, through you and me. As God's Holy Spirit comes to live within us, we are now the place where people meet with God, because God indwells us. Every true follower of Jesus. What a privilege for us. What a responsibility for us, being these kind of walking, talking temples. Yeah, this happens when we're gathered together like this morning, but it happens when we're scattered through the week as well. It's quite epic. Okay, that's a lot of things to think about. But so what? Well, the interesting thing for me here is that Jesus does not spend most of his time digging into the significance and the riches of this idea that we are the children of God. Even though it's awesome, he doesn't dig into this freedom that we have by virtue of our place in God's royal family. Even though this is awesome in the kind of true sense of the word. If you're not a Christian here today, I guess I do need to say, see what an awesome privilege is on offer to you through Jesus. Galatians, another book in the Bible, tells us this. In Christ Jesus, you're all children of God through faith. It's just a step away from you if you don't have your trust in Jesus today. One step of faith. This is what could be yours, a prince of the great king. The freedom of the children of God. What are you turning your nose up at? What are you leaving unclaimed and ignored when you will not take that step of faith towards Jesus? Claim that faith today. Claim that place today, that identity, that privilege. Claim it through Jesus. If you want to do something about that today, talk to somebody you came with. Talk to somebody you know. Talk to our host. If you're with us online, you can talk to me later. Just don't walk away from this empty and unchanged. I just feel like we need to say that while we're in the middle of thinking about this. What a mighty privilege. We can't really get our heads around it. If we only started to grasp the edge of what it means, we'll begin to correctly feel the weight of what God does next, of what Jesus does. See, Jesus has all this privilege as the son of the great king, the prince who doesn't need to pay, the freedom not to pay, but the freedom to live. And yet he chooses to pay, even though he owes nothing to anyone. He chooses to take the place of those others rather than the children of the king. He chooses to put himself among the outsiders, the strangers, the foreigner, rather than claim that privilege. Why does he do that? Well, the story tells us, so that we may not cause offense. The imaginary situation we started with, where this person with all their rank and privilege comes to serve you and lays all that down, is shocking. This is a shocking thing the son has done here. This is important. If the son willingly gives up his privilege so as not to cause offense, well, surely every Christian who shares this same privilege should be ready to give that up as well. In fact, did you notice here that Jesus doesn't just give up his privilege? He gave up Peter's privilege for Peter. He gave it up for him. Like, you don't have to pay, but we're going to pay anyway. I've given up your privilege, not just my own. So you and I, we should probably be ready for Jesus to give up our privileges as well. Now, when we start to unpack this, it's a pretty tricky thing. It's important we don't jump to conclusions too quickly. What is Jesus teaching us here so that we may not cause offense? Is he teaching us Christians should never offend anyone, ever, under any circumstance? We are not to be people who causes offense. We should always comply with the world around us. Never rub anyone up the wrong way. That, in some ways, that would make life easier. You know what you got to do, right? You just need to fit in, conform, and go along with things. But that is not what Jesus is teaching. And we know that because in the story of Jesus up to this point, he is quite happy to seriously offend. He doesn't hold back criticism. He's happy to reject others' way. He's not an easy-ozy, whatever goes, I can just fit in kind of person. That's not who he ordinarily is. Back in chapter 15, there's this controversy over washing hands before you eat. It was a tradition that was really important to the religious leaders of the time. And frankly, it's something that doesn't feel like it's that big a deal to go along with. Just wash your hands, Jesus. It's not that hard. Just wash your hands. It's, less germs, less trouble. All done. But Jesus will not comply. Instead, he lays into them so sharply, his disciples feel the need to almost tell him off. They're like, do you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this because Jesus has spoken so sharply to them? Of course he knew he had offended them. He intended to. So it's not as simple as thinking we should never cause offense to anyone, always go along with others. The question we have to ask is, what is different here and chapter 15? What's different between these two situations? How are you and me meant to figure out when it is we should be causing offense and when it is we should be avoiding it? How do we know when to make a fuss and when to go along with things? Well, dead dude J.C. Ryle has an excellent way of putting it. He captures the key difference between these situations. He says we should never give up God's rights, but we may sometimes safely give up our own. So if you think about what's going on in Matthew chapter 15, well, Jesus offends the Pharisees rather than going along with them because the Pharisees have placed their rules and their traditions over God's ways. Actually, their rules and traditions are in opposition to God's ways. So to go along with them wouldn't just be giving up Jesus' freedom, it would be giving up God's rights. And it's never our place to give up the Lord's right to obedience. As I've been thinking about it, the best way I've come to here is the lens to think about our freedom and our rights as the privileged children of God and what we are to do with that freedom and our rights. The best lens I've found to think about it is the lens of love, the lens of service to others, loving service to others. I think that helps us begin to see which way to go, when to offend and when to avoid giving offense. I think that is what guides Jesus. See, in chapter 15, what would truly be loving those Pharisees, those teachers, those religious leaders? What best serves their good? If Jesus were to go along with their tradition, honor their tradition over God's ways, well, then he wouldn't be loving them. He'd be leading them further away from God. He'd implicitly be approving and agreeing with their traditions, outranking God's law. Jesus offends them not because he likes winding people up. He offends them because he loves them and he wants to turn them back. Now, as we wrestle with this question of where we should give up and where we should stand up, Jesus shows us the way. There's a famous passage written about Jesus in another book in the Bible called Philippians in chapter 2, celebrating how Jesus gives up his rights as the one Son of God in order to serve, in order to seek, in order to save. And that passage encourages us to share in the same attitude. So in today's passage, when you're thinking about these tax collectors and this tax that needs to be paid, what is true service to those collecting the tax? Not to cause offense on that occasion. I don't know who needs to hear this morning, but Christians, we don't always have to cause as much offense as we possibly can. It's a bit of a relief sometimes. We should never give up God's rights, but we can sometimes safely give up our own. Jesus doesn't need to pay. He has the right to freedom. He gives up that right so that there is no stumbling block in their way. No stumbling block in their way where? In their way towards faith in Jesus. He doesn't want to obstruct their journey towards true faith in him. And you see this same pattern followed by Paul, one of Jesus' first followers. He explains this is exactly what he is doing as well. He says he's free. He's got all these rights. He belongs to no one, but he has made himself a slave. He is seeking to serve others. Why? To win as many as possible. Win them for what? To win them to life. To win them to salvation, to win them to Jesus. Now, we have privilege as God's children. We have freedom as God's children. But we can lay that down. We can give that up for the sake of others. We can give that up to serve those who don't know him yet, that we might win more of them to everlasting life as a child of God. Let's try and get practical for a minute and think about how you and I might live out something like this. Well, probably we're not going to run into a situation where voluntary submission to Jewish food laws or Jewish taxes or traditions like Paul or Jesus would actually be helpful. But we do still live among different groups and different peoples and different individuals even, who have their own ways of doing life, their own patterns and rules. And though we're free from those rules as children of the great King, we actually can lay down that for the good of others. What does this really look like? Well, I'm quite a big fan of meat. Quite like meat myself. As a Christian, I'm free to eat meat. Jesus has declared all foods clean, the Gospel of Mark tells us. But when I go to dinner with vegetarian friends, if I have to, when I go to dinner with vegetarian friends, I can lay down that freedom so as not to cause offense. No bag of bacon in the pocket, a Ziploc of bacon. No need for that. Bean casserole is just fine for me. It is a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that could be worth making. That's a bit of a facetious example most of the time, but for some cultures, pork or beef off limits. I know there are religious roots for both of those, but still, when I'm exercising hospitality, I don't need to deliberately cook them beef just to make a point. I can give up my freedom, my rights, out of love for others. As I've been thinking about this week, though, the further we get into this, the more complicated it becomes. Not looking to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Well, should I go to this wedding that is outside of God's design? Should I celebrate this declaration that is in opposition to his design? Would I be giving up my freedom if I were to do that? Or would it be the opposite of loving and serving them? Would I have given up God's rights, not just mine, implying with my presence or my approval that God doesn't need to be honored as Lord and he's just fine with us doing whatever we like? It's really tricky. But at least if we are asking these questions, at least if we know what lens to look through, we have a right way of a right direction. Is this me giving up my rights, or am I giving up God's rights for him? Is this really me serving them with love, or am I misleading them with false love? It does take some deeper thinking, and I think, honestly, it's hard to come to a clear answer for lots of the situations that you and I are going to run into in our ordinary, everyday life. We are really going to have to seek wisdom from God, but one of the great things he promises us is if we lack wisdom, we can ask him for it, and he will give it to us. When we know this is tricky, when we know it's not straightforward, we know we want to love and serve those around us, but we don't know what is loving service to them, then we can go and ask God for wisdom. This tension between our freedom and not causing offense as a tricky one. But doesn't just have significance as we interact with the world around us and the world outside. It has significance even inside God's family as well. So as a church, if you've been around a while, you might have heard us say we try and practice what we call theological humility. We recognize Christians come to different decisions on a range of issues, even when reading and treasuring the same Bible as one another. And we ask one another to keep those secondary issues where we've come to different conclusions secondary for the sake of the gospel. Let's work together. We ask that we don't force everyone to share our understanding. We try not to be stumbling blocks. And why do we do that? Because the Bible teaches us to. If you want to read more about this, the book of Romans in chapter 14 goes into this in detail. It explains how Christians should conduct ourselves when there are disputable matters in view, where we don't agree. And it calls for the same attitude that Jesus displays. Lay down our rights, lay down our freedoms, seek the other's good. Don't look down on those who understand differently from us. Don't judge them or treat with contempt. Work for peace. Try and build one another up anyway. Imagine that, trying to build up someone you disagree with. That is countercultural, isn't it? What is good for them? What's for their best? You can see the same word picture here of a stumbling block. Make up your mind not to put any stumbling block in the way of a brother and sister. It's no accident that Paul is using the same language as Jesus as he speaks about this. Again, inside the church, this is easier in theory than it is in practice. But it's another place that the teaching from today's passage really does come home. It's another place where we have to try and walk that different line, balancing giving up our own rights without giving up God's. I need to close, but before I do, I want to actually finish with an encouragement from today's passage. The passage closed with God's supernatural provision. It's a hard calling to lay down your rights, to give up your freedom. That's not an easy thing for us to do. It's a difficult thing. It's a hard thing to know what is truly serving others with love. But as Jesus calls us into this, we also see in the picture where he calls us in that he will provide what we need to do it. Here he provides the tax money. It's very simple and practical, just provided in a really extraordinary way. For you and for me, what we need most of the time is more wisdom or more love for the people around us, or more grace beyond what we find in our own hearts. But God can and will do that same miracle of provision for us. He can give us that gift, the ability to extend grace and love and service to others we disagree with. He can do that through his Spirit alive within us. We should ask for that. We can and we should depend on his help for it, not thinking that we've got this within ourselves. So here we land. That is a short passage, but I think it introduces an important and a tricky issue. An amazing privilege that's ours through Jesus. A real challenge for us to see how Jesus in his perfect wisdom navigates that privilege and that freedom. We need to ask God's help to live this out. So we're going to thank him now for the privilege in prayer. We're going to ask him for help in laying it down. Let's pray together. Lord, what an awesome thing it is that we should be called children of God. Lord, you know what we really are. We are but dust. We're broken and twisted. We make a mess of things. We belong nowhere near you, and yet you have called us your children through Jesus. What an incredible privilege. But Lord, help us to see what Jesus does with his privilege, laying it down for the love of others. God, help us. Help us to see where we need to lay down our privileges, our rights, our freedoms for the sake of others. Those inside your church, those outside your church. God, help us with this difficult balance of knowing when to offend and when to avoid it, when to exercise our freedom and when to yield. Lord, we acknowledge that this is hard. Give us wisdom and power to do it for Jesus' sake. Amen. Now, as we close today, I wanted us to sing together, just going back one step, reminding us of that great truth that God has invited us and made us his children. So, Chan, Ben, thank you very much. Let's turn our hearts back to that remarkable reminder from Jesus.
Let's stand and sing this together.
Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me, and know his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the sun sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child. There's a place for me. I There's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
Thank you. Please be seated.
Thank you, band. In a minute, Matt will come up and respond to some of the questions submitted on Slido. Don't know about you, but talk like that makes me have far more questions than answers, or even fully formed thoughts. So, why not take a little bit of time to chat with each other? I think there are questions on the screen. And use them to discuss maybe some of these questions with each other. It can feel awkward to talk to folks that maybe you don't know, but lean into the awkwardness. It's okay to feel it's awkward, and we'll come back up and chat through things in a little bit. Perfect. Okay, Matt has just said, let's try and bang out loads of these questions, so buckle in. Here we go.
They're such interesting questions. It's such an interesting topic to think about, isn't it?
Okay, let's go. What is the difference between temple tax and tithing?
Okay, so this temple tax, it's not clear that it had a kind of religious foundation, but it was to kind of pay specifically for a building. Tithing is a kind of giving in proportion, right? A tithe comes from a tenth, a giving in proportion to what you have. The temple tax was a flat tax on every person, but I wouldn't think that we would argue that the temple tax continues through into our stage of life at all. And we would have differences of opinion between Christians over whether even this idea of tithing, of giving back to God a tenth of what he's given to you, is necessarily a command for all Christians. What Christians do agree on is that God calls us to be generous stewards of everything that he has given to us. So I think in terms of things like, I guess you've heard us talk about a church, talk about us as a church. We've been struggling financially. We don't often have enough money to pay for all the things we'd like to pay for. We're not commanding you to give us money, but we do encourage you as followers of Jesus to be like him and exercise sacrificial generosity with what he's entrusted to you. But don't feel like we're obliging you with a tax. I don't think there's a straight line between that temple tax and paying for church. Doesn't work like that.
Thank you.
That was a long answer to a short question. I'll go faster. I'll be better. I'll be more concise.
We're not going to rattle through them all with that. Sorry. Right. Is there significance in having Peter fish for the money? To send Peter to run this kind of errand seems odd during a festival.
So the temple tax is typically paid at the Passover, and so it's kind of odd that they're thinking about paying the temple tax anyway, because Jesus is going to Jerusalem for the Passover. If you know the story about the money changers in the temple, they're there because the temple tax has to be paid in a particular kind of coinage, Tyrian coinage, that you have to exchange your local money for. So it's kind of odd that they're paying the temple tax in Capernaum, far away, before the Passover. Is there any significance in Peter fishing? Lots of commentators like to notice that Peter was a fisherman, but Peter's fishing business was all about nets and boats, not using a line. Here he's specifically sent to go and use a line, and people kind of wonder different things about that. They say, is the Lord telling Peter to go and exercise his occupation, to pay his taxes? Is this much less miraculous and much more human? Because there are other kind of historical stories about people finding money or precious things in the mouths of fishes. People who are skeptical of the Bible and think it's all made up want to say, this looks just like those other stories about precious things in the mouths of fishes. It must be just a made-up thing, and it's not really about miracles. We believe in a God who can do whatever he likes, who commands the wind and wave and fishes, and can put money in a fish's mouth whenever he wants to. That's trivia for the God who made the universe by his word. So I'm totally happy with him doing miracles. There's lots of things to talk about, aren't there?
Okay. In line with that a little bit. Ish.
I thought she was going to say, in a few words.
No, don't worry, I wouldn't do that to you. Are there any jobs going at Hope City currently? I'm going to answer that one in that, is there money for more jobs at Hope City? Potentially not. Does that mean that Matt is not creative and that there isn't more work to do? No. So if you are interested, if that is your question, speak to Matt, because he loves things like that. Okay, what shall we do if another Christian offends me?
Answering this question in the abstract is not possible. We'll come on in a couple of weeks to a passage that talks about what to do if somebody in the church has wronged you, and Jesus gives a pattern. Go to them with somebody else, tell it to the church, and then ultimately treat them like a tax collector or a publican is the pattern you'll find in Matthew chapter 18. So there's some situations where the right thing to do is to confront the person who's offended you and sinned against you. Other times the right thing to do is to give up your privilege to exercise grace. Jesus, just after talking about how to address those issues with other people in Matthew 18, goes on to tell the parable of the unmerciful servant. If you're familiar with that, there's a servant who owes far more money than he can ever repay. The master forgives him. Then the servant goes and throttles somebody who owes him 2 pence. And Jesus says, that is the sort of thing that brings you into judgment. He's encouraging us to see God has forgiven us so much. How can we not forgive other people small things? So I think you get both ends, right? You get a pattern for how to go and address when you've been sinned against, and you get a call to grace towards one another, to give up your rights. I think, again, it's back to that lens of love. What is truly loving the other person? Is confronting them in their wrongdoing truly loving them? Or is exercising grace towards them, like grace has been given to you, truly loving them? And honestly, I think it's often hard to know. May the Lord give you wisdom when you seek him in that. Talk to people about it. Ask friends. Share counsel.
And leading on from that, how do we relate on a daily basis with friends, family that are in same-sex relationships?
I think that's exactly into this category of questions where we're probably not going to have one answer between us all as Christians. Each one of us is going to be challenged to think about what is truly love towards those people, what is most likely, what is most helpful to them in terms of their eternity, in terms of where they will find themselves on the last day when God comes to judge according to God's own law. What will help them? And I think it's just hard to know. But if at least we start with this attitude of love, if we start with this desire for their good, and if we ask God for help, I think that puts us in a good place to do the best thing. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all for that situation. And I know, and various people have spoken to me about difficult situations you're confronted with in our modern world, where people are living in many different ways. It's not a novelty. In the ancient world, people were living in lots of different ways as well, and Christians stood out in the midst of them. It's not a novelty for Jesus. As Jesus walks around, he encounters people all over the map on how they're conducting themselves. And that's why I love spending time in the Gospels, as we get to watch how Jesus deals with a broken world around him. He can school us on the right way to do that. It's tricky.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. Before you go, tell us, in a few short words, big idea for today.
Love limits its freedom. Love limits its freedom.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, thank you once again for joining us this morning. In a morning, we'll have some time to chat over coffee and cakes. To help with this, if the kind of front 3-row seats, if folks could help to... It's the back ones. If the back 3 seats, 3 rows could be moved. Please only do that if you are able. If you see somebody who shouldn't be doing it, who's trying to be stoic and doing it, just lovingly tell them to sit back down. I'm the person that would need told to sit back down, so yeah, go for it. Please remember to also collect your children, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to finish just with this very short prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord, please help us to be like Jesus. Help us to put others first like Jesus put us first, to humbly consider others before ourselves as we go into our weeks. Amen. Thanks.